You wake up feeling perfectly healthy. By noon, you're vomiting uncontrollably. By evening, your skin has turned blue-gray, your eyes have sunken into your skull, and you're so dehydrated your body has begun to shrivel. By midnight, you're dead. This wasn't poison or some exotic tropical disease. This was cholera, and in the 1830s, it swept across Europe like a medieval plague, killing tens of thousands in a matter of months. Cholera was different from other epidemics Europeans had experienced. It killed with terrifying speed, sometimes in just a few hours. It turned healthy adults into corpses in the time it took to eat dinner. It didn't discriminate by class, killing aristocrats in their mansions as readily as beggars in slums. And no one understood what caused it, how it spread, or how to stop it. Doctors were helpless. Governments panicked. Cities descended into chaos as corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. This is the story of the first cholera pandemic to reach Europe. The disease that killed hundreds of thousands, sparked riots and revolutions, exposed the filth of industrial cities, and forced Europe to confront the fact that progress had created perfect conditions for mass death. This is about fear, science, and the disease that changed how cities were built. Cholera had existed in India for centuries, possibly millennia, endemic to the Ganges Delta, where it killed regularly but locally. The disease was caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, though no one in the 1830s knew this. What they knew was that cholera killed faster than almost any disease they had encountered, and it killed through a horrifying process. The symptoms began suddenly. Violent diarrhea and vomiting that expelled fluids from the body at an astonishing rate. Victims could lose up to 20 liters of fluid in a single day, more than 3 times the volume of blood in the human body. This massive dehydration caused the body to literally shrivel. The skin turned blue-gray as blood thickened and oxygen delivery failed. The eyes sank into the skull. The fingers and toes shriveled into washerwoman's hands. The voice became a whisper, then disappeared entirely. Blood pressure dropped. The heart struggled to pump thickened blood, and death came from hypovolemic shock. The terrifying aspect was the speed. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There were documented cases of people dying within 3 hours of the first symptoms. Even in slower cases, death typically came within 24 hours, and roughly half of people who contracted cholera died. The mortality rate was staggering. For centuries, cholera had remained largely confined to India. But in 1817, something changed. The first cholera pandemic began, spreading beyond India's borders through the expanding networks of global trade. By 1830, the second pandemic had begun, and this time, cholera was heading for Europe. The disease followed trade routes from India to Afghanistan, Persia, and Russia. It moved with armies, merchants, and pilgrims. In 1830, cholera reached Moscow, killing thousands. In 1831, it arrived in St. Petersburg, then spread through Poland, Prussia, Austria, and Germany. By 1832, cholera had reached London and Paris, Europe's 2 largest and most advanced cities. The disease that had seemed safely distant, a problem of exotic foreign lands, was now killing Europeans in their own homes. European doctors and scientists had no idea what caused cholera or how it spread. The dominant medical theory was miasma, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air emanating from rotting organic matter, sewage, and filth. This theory seemed to explain cholera's patterns. It was worse in slums with poor sanitation, so clearly the foul air in those areas was causing the disease. But miasma theory was wrong, and this fundamental misunderstanding would cost thousands of lives. The actual cause was contaminated water. Cholera spreads through the fecal-oral route. Infected people excrete massive quantities of cholera bacteria in their diarrhea. This waste contaminates water sources. People drink the contaminated water, and they become infected. In cities where drinking water came from rivers and wells contaminated with sewage, cholera spread explosively. But because doctors didn't understand waterborne transmission, their treatments and prevention measures were often useless or counterproductive. Early medical treatments for cholera were brutal and ineffective. Doctors bled patients, drawing blood from people already dying of dehydration. They administered massive doses of calomel, mercury chloride, which caused mercury poisoning on top of cholera. They used opium to stop diarrhea, which prevented the body from expelling the infection. They tried everything: brandy, vinegar, hot baths, cold baths, electric shocks. Almost nothing worked. The death rate for hospitalized cholera patients was barely better than for those who received no treatment at all. When cholera arrived in a city, panic followed immediately. The disease's terrifying symptoms and rapid progression created fear unlike anything most Europeans had experienced. Unlike tuberculosis or typhus, which killed slowly over weeks or months, cholera struck suddenly and killed quickly. You could attend a friend's dinner party and be dead before breakfast. This immediacy created psychological terror. In Paris in March 1832, cholera killed with shocking speed. Over 18,000 Parisians died in just a few months, roughly 2% of the entire population. The wealthy fled the city, abandoning homes and businesses to escape the disease. Those who couldn't afford to flee barricaded themselves indoors, terrified of the miasma they believed spread cholera. The streets emptied except for doctors, undertakers, and the desperately poor who had nowhere else to go. Hospitals were overwhelmed within days. The Hôtel Dieu Hospital in Paris, already overcrowded before cholera arrived, became a charnel house. Patients died so quickly that bodies piled up faster than staff could remove them. Witnesses described patients lying 2 or 3 to a bed, with corpses stacked in corners, waiting for burial carts. The smell of death, vomit, and diarrhea was overwhelming. Many hospital staff abandoned their posts rather than face almost certain infection. The death toll was so high that normal burial procedures collapsed. Paris ran out of coffins within weeks. Bodies were wrapped in sheets or simply thrown into mass graves. The cemeteries filled so quickly that authorities had to open new burial grounds. Père Lachaise Cemetery received hundreds of cholera victims daily, buried in trenches rather than individual graves. The city's normal death rate of 50 to 60 people per day exploded to over 500 daily at the pandemic's peak. London experienced similar chaos when cholera arrived in February 1832. The disease hit the poorest neighborhoods hardest: Southwark, Bermondsey, and the East End slums, where thousands lived in appalling conditions. In these areas, human waste flowed through open sewers into the Thames, the same river that provided drinking water. Contaminated water pumps became focal points of infection, killing everyone who drank from them. The British government's response was inadequate and confused. Authorities established cholera hospitals in warehouse buildings, but these became death traps. Infected patients were isolated with other infected patients, ensuring maximum exposure. Medical care was minimal. Many patients were simply left to die. The mortality rate in these cholera hospitals approached 60%. Class tensions exploded during the epidemic. The poor noticed that doctors were far more interested in studying their bodies than saving their lives. Rumors spread that doctors were deliberately murdering cholera patients to obtain bodies for anatomical dissection, a suspicion that wasn't entirely unfounded given the body-snatching scandals of the era. In several cities, mobs attacked cholera hospitals, liberating patients and sometimes killing medical staff. The cholera panic also sparked conspiracy theories. Some claimed the disease was caused by poison deliberately spread by government agents to reduce the population. Others blamed foreigners, Jews, or political enemies. In Russia, cholera riots targeted German doctors who were blamed for spreading the disease. In Hungary, nobles were attacked because peasants believed they had poisoned wells. The epidemic exposed and amplified existing social tensions. Religious interpretations of cholera were common. Many saw the disease as divine punishment for sin, pointing to its tendency to strike the poor, the immoral, and the intemperate. This moralistic interpretation led to calls for public penance, religious processions, and the closing of theaters and taverns. Some religious authorities claimed cholera was God's judgment on industrial society's greed and corruption. Cholera didn't just kill people, it destabilized governments and sparked revolutions. The 1830s were already a politically volatile period in Europe, with liberal movements challenging conservative monarchies. The cholera pandemic poured gasoline on these political fires. In France, the cholera epidemic of 1832 coincided with rising opposition to King Louis Philippe's government. The government's inadequate response to cholera, its failure to protect the poor, and its apparent indifference to mass death in working-class neighborhoods fueled revolutionary sentiment. In June 1832, just months after cholera's arrival, Republicans launched the June Rebellion in Paris, attempting to overthrow the monarchy. The rebellion was crushed, but the connection between cholera and political upheaval was clear. The rebellion's most famous casualty wasn't actually a cholera victim, but became associated with the epidemic in public memory. General Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, a popular opposition figure, died of cholera in June 1832, and his funeral became the trigger for the June Rebellion. Tens of thousands of people attended his funeral, which transformed into a massive anti-government demonstration. The crowd clashed with troops, barricades went up across Paris, and for 2 days the city was in open revolt. This is the rebellion immortalized in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. In Britain, cholera contributed to the political crisis that led to the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded voting rights. The epidemic had exposed the terrible conditions in working-class neighborhoods and the government's inability or unwillingness to protect the poor. Middle-class reformers used cholera as evidence that the existing political system was corrupt and incompetent, arguing that broader political representation was needed to address public health crises. In Central Europe, cholera intersected with nationalist movements and revolutionary organizing. The disease's spread through Polish, German, and Italian territories highlighted the weakness of existing governments. Revolutionary groups used cholera response efforts as cover for organizing, building networks that would later support the revolutions of 1848. The epidemic also exposed the fundamental inequality of European industrial societies. While cholera did occasionally kill aristocrats and wealthy citizens, it disproportionately devastated the poor. This wasn't random, it was structural. The poor lived in overcrowded slums with no sanitation. They drank water contaminated with sewage. They couldn't afford to flee cities when epidemics struck. They had to continue working even when sick, spreading the disease further. And they received worse medical care than the wealthy. This inequality was visible in death statistics. In Paris, cholera mortality in wealthy arrondissements like the 1st and 2nd was less than 1%. In working-class arrondissements like the 12th and 19th, mortality exceeded 4%. Similar patterns existed in London, Berlin, and Vienna. The death rate in slums was 5 to 10 times higher than in wealthy neighborhoods. Cholera didn't discriminate biologically, but it discriminated socially. As cholera ravaged European cities, doctors and scientists desperately sought to understand the disease. Their efforts produced some remarkable insights, but also demonstrated how wrong scientific medicine could be when operating from false assumptions. The miasma theory dominated medical thinking. If bad air caused cholera, then the solution was to eliminate sources of bad air, clean up filth, improve ventilation, burn aromatic substances to purify the air. These measures, while often useless against cholera specifically, did have some benefit. Cleaning up accumulated garbage and human waste reduced disease generally, even if it didn't prevent cholera transmission through contaminated water. But some doctors began noticing patterns that didn't fit miasma theory. They observed that cholera seemed to spread along water routes. Neighborhoods sharing water sources experienced simultaneous outbreaks. Areas with separate water supplies were sometimes spared even when surrounded by infection. A few pioneering physicians began suspecting that water, not air, was the key to cholera transmission. The breakthrough wouldn't come until the 1850s, when John Snow in London would definitively prove cholera was waterborne through his famous investigation of the Broad Street pump outbreak. But in the 1830s, the waterborne theory was just beginning to emerge from careful observation of outbreak patterns. Treatment approaches were equally varied and mostly ineffective. Some doctors recognized that dehydration was the key problem and attempted to replace fluids by having patients drink water or weak tea. This was correct in principle, but often failed because patients couldn't keep fluids down due to constant vomiting. The breakthrough treatment, intravenous fluid replacement, wouldn't be developed for decades. Other doctors focused on stopping the symptoms rather than replacing lost fluids. They used opium and other drugs to stop diarrhea, not understanding that diarrhea was the body's attempt to expel the infection. Stopping diarrhea often made patients worse by allowing cholera bacteria to remain in the intestines longer. Some treatments were based on the idea that cholera was caused by corruption of the blood or organs. These treatments included bloodletting, removing blood from already dehydrated patients, administering toxic metals like mercury and antimony, and various forms of purging designed to cleanse the body. These treatments killed almost as often as they cured. A few doctors stumbled onto treatments that actually helped. Those who focused on keeping patients warm, comfortable, and hydrated had better results than those who used aggressive interventions. But without understanding the underlying cause, systematic treatment development was impossible. The cholera pandemics of the 1830s and subsequent decades ultimately transformed European cities in ways that saved millions of lives. The epidemic forced governments and urban planners to confront the appalling sanitary conditions created by rapid industrialization and urbanization. Before cholera, most European cities had medieval sanitation infrastructure completely inadequate for their 19th century populations. Human waste was dumped into cesspools, open sewers, or directly into rivers. Drinking water came from wells that were often contaminated by nearby cesspools or from rivers that also served as sewers. Housing was overcrowded, with entire families living in single rooms. Ventilation was poor. Food safety was unregulated. These conditions had always been unhealthy, but rapid urban population growth in the early 19th century made them catastrophic. Cholera made these invisible problems visible in the form of mass death. When thousands died in a neighborhood, when water pumps became focal points of infection, when certain streets became killing zones while others remained relatively safe, patterns emerged that demanded explanation and action. London, after cholera, began the massive infrastructure project that would become the modern sewage system. Joseph Bazalgette designed and built over 1,000 miles of underground sewers that carried waste away from the city rather than dumping it into the Thames. This project, completed over several decades, fundamentally changed London's relationship with water and waste. Paris underwent similar transformation under Baron Haussmann, who redesigned much of the city in the 1850s and 1860s. While Haussmann's renovations were primarily political, designed to make barricades impossible and suppress future revolutions, they also included modern sewage systems and water supply infrastructure that dramatically improved public health. Other European cities followed suit. Berlin, Vienna, Brussels, and dozens of smaller cities built modern water and sewage systems. These projects were expensive, requiring massive public investment and decades of construction. But they worked. Cities with modern sanitation saw cholera mortality drop dramatically in subsequent epidemics. The cholera pandemic also led to the development of public health as a government function. Before cholera, most governments did not see health as a public responsibility. Disease was a private matter or an act of God. But cholera demonstrated that disease could threaten social order, economic productivity, and political stability. Governments needed to act. Britain established the General Board of Health in 1848, giving the government authority to investigate sanitation conditions and mandate improvements. Other countries created similar institutions. These early public health agencies had limited power and resources, but they established the principle that government had responsibility for population health. Building codes and housing regulations emerged from cholera's lessons. Governments began requiring minimum standards for ventilation, sanitation, and space in housing. They regulated food markets and water supplies. They established quarantine procedures for disease control. These regulations were often poorly enforced and applied unevenly, but they represented fundamental shifts in thinking about urban life and government responsibility. The cholera pandemic of the 1830s was not a one-time event. Cholera would return to Europe repeatedly throughout the 19th century in successive pandemic waves: 1848 to 1849, 1852 to 1859, 1863 to 1875, and 1881 to 1896. Each wave killed tens of thousands. Each wave sparked panic. But each successive pandemic was less devastating than the previous one as cities implemented sanitation improvements and medical understanding gradually improved. The 1848 to 1849 cholera pandemic was particularly significant because it coincided with the revolutions of 1848 that swept across Europe. Revolutionary upheaval disrupted sanitation and health care, creating perfect conditions for cholera spread. At the same time, cholera intensified revolutionary sentiment by demonstrating government incompetence and highlighting social inequalities. Disease and revolution fed each other. The 1854 cholera outbreak in London produced the breakthrough that finally explained how cholera spread. Dr. John Snow conducted his famous investigation of the Broad Street pump, demonstrating that cholera cases clustered around a specific water pump that was contaminated with sewage. By mapping cases and interviewing survivors, Snow proved that cholera was waterborne, not airborne. When authorities disabled the Broad Street pump, the outbreak ended. This was the birth of modern epidemiology. But even with Snow's proof, acceptance of waterborne transmission was slow. The miasma theory was deeply entrenched, and many doctors refused to abandon it even in the face of contradictory evidence. It wasn't until the 1880s when Robert Koch identified the cholera bacterium and definitively proved the waterborne transmission mechanism that the medical establishment fully accepted the truth. By the late 19th century, cholera's impact on Europe was diminishing. Cities with modern sanitation systems largely eliminated the disease. Cholera became a disease of the poor, the unsanitary, and the backward, reinforcing European assumptions about their own superiority. When cholera struck European cities in the late 19th century, it was mostly confined to immigrant neighborhoods, slums, and areas with poor sanitation. This created a dangerous complacency. Europeans began believing they had conquered cholera through their superior science and sanitation. They failed to recognize that cholera remained endemic in Asia and could still strike wherever sanitation failed. This complacency would be shattered in the 20th century when cholera repeatedly struck regions destabilized by war, natural disaster, or state collapse. The cholera pandemic of the 1830s killed hundreds of thousands of Europeans, but it also saved millions of lives by forcing fundamental changes in how cities were built and maintained. The disease that killed in hours ultimately transformed urban life in ways that protected generations to come. The most important legacy was sanitation infrastructure. The massive investment in sewage systems, clean water supplies, and waste management fundamentally changed urban environments. These systems didn't just prevent cholera, they reduced all waterborne diseases including typhoid, dysentery, and other diarrheal diseases that had killed millions over centuries. Clean water and proper sewage disposal are among the most important public health interventions in human history, and cholera was the crisis that made them happen. Public health as a government function emerged from cholera's lessons. The idea that government has responsibility for population health, that disease prevention is a legitimate use of state power, that public health infrastructure is a worthy public investment. All these concepts were established or strengthened by cholera epidemics. Modern public health systems trace their origins to the cholera pandemics of the 19th century. Medical understanding also advanced through cholera research. The disease forced doctors to think systematically about disease transmission, to use statistical analysis and mapping to track outbreaks, and to question received wisdom when it contradicted observed evidence. John Snow's cholera investigation in 1854 established methods that would become foundational to epidemiology. But cholera also revealed uncomfortable truths about industrial society. The disease thrived in the slums created by rapid industrialization. It killed the workers whose labor powered economic growth. It exposed the class inequalities that meant poor people lived in conditions that virtually guaranteed disease and early death. Cholera demonstrated that progress had created new forms of suffering. The story of cholera in Europe is ultimately about how societies respond to crisis. The 1830s pandemic killed hundreds of thousands and caused immense suffering, but it also prompted changes that saved millions of lives over subsequent generations. The disease forced Europe to build modern sanitation systems, establish public health institutions, develop epidemiological methods, and recognize that population health requires collective action and public investment.